The Panzer commander tasted dust and diesel. His Tiger I, 60 tons of Krupp steel and engineering pride, idled in the bocage shadows where the hedgerows grew thick enough to hide a tank. Almost. Through the cupola hatch, Oberleutnant Klaus Becker watched the sky. Not the horizon where American infantry might appear, but the sky, empty and blue and silent. Too silent. The morning had begun with confidence. His crew had serviced the 88mm gun, checked the transmission that always threatened to fail, painted fresh kill rings on the barrel. 3 Shermans yesterday, 4 the day before. The Tiger was invincible from the front, they said. The armor too thick, the gun too powerful. American tanks burned like gasoline cans when the 88 found them. The crew called them Ronsons after the cigarette lighter. 1 shot, 1 fire. Then the sound came. Not the rumble of engines or the crack of artillery. A different sound. Higher pitched, growing. A sound that made veteran tankers reach for hatches before their minds understood why. Becker looked up and saw them, silver specks against the summer sky, growing larger, diving. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, 8 of them, wings heavy with ordnance. He screamed into the intercom for the driver to move, now, move. But 60 tons do not move quickly, and the hedgerow that had been cover was now a cage. The first rocket struck the engine deck. The Tiger did not explode dramatically. It simply stopped being a tank and became a furnace. This is the story of how the most feared ground weapon of the Second World War learned to fear the sky. This is about the collision between tactical dominance and technological evolution, about how invincibility became obsolete in the summer of 1944, when American fighter bombers rewrote the rules of armored warfare and turned the hedgerows of France into a graveyard for machines that were supposed to be unkillable. This is about what happens when absolute faith in steel meets absolute commitment to air power, and what burns in between. The Tiger tank entered German military consciousness as something close to mythology. Deployed first on the Eastern Front in late 1942, then in Tunisia in 1943, it had compiled a service record that seemed to validate every engineering decision, every hour of labor, every mark spent on its development. The armor was extraordinary, 100 millimeters thick on the turret front, thick enough to defeat any Allied tank at combat ranges. The 88mm KWK-36 gun could penetrate American and British armor at distances where return fire was impossible. In a direct engagement, tank versus tank, the Tiger was nearly unstoppable. Soviet tankers on the Eastern Front reported instances where T-34 shells simply bounced off Tiger armor, leaving scratches where there should have been penetration. One Tiger commander, Otto Carius, would end the war with over 150 verified tank kills. The machine had become legend even before the first Tiger rolled off the Arnhem landing craft onto the beaches where Operation Overlord would decide the war's outcome. German tank crews believed in this legend. They had reason to. Every tactical manual, every after-action report, every story from veterans reinforced the same message. In direct combat, nothing could match the Tiger. Panzer training emphasized positioning, fields of fire, the importance of frontal engagement where the armor was thickest and the gun most effective. The doctrine was simple. Find a defensive position, let the enemy come to you, destroy them at range before they could close in. It had worked in Russia. It had worked, when supplies allowed, in Italy. It would work in France. What the doctrine did not account for, what the training manuals and the after-action reports and the stories from veterans did not mention, was what happens when the enemy stops playing by the rules you have mastered. The Americans arrived in Normandy with tanks that were, by objective measurement, inferior. The M4 Sherman carried a 75mm gun that barely penetrated Tiger armor from the front. Its own armor was thin enough that German anti-tank guns could defeat it at ranges where Sherman crews could not effectively return fire. In the bocage country of Normandy, where hedgerows created countless ambush positions and open terrain was measured in dozens of yards rather than miles, this disadvantage became catastrophic. U.S. tank battalions reported loss rates that should have halted offensive operations. One Sherman battalion lost 14 tanks in a single engagement near Villers-Bocage. Another lost 23 in 2 days of fighting. The Germans called it a turkey shoot. But the Americans understood something the Germans had not yet grasped. Tanks do not fight alone anymore. Wars are not won by the best individual weapon, but by the best integration of systems. Infantry, artillery, logistics, and crucially, devastatingly, air power. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not designed to kill tanks. It was designed as a high-altitude escort fighter, a role in which it was competent but not exceptional. The Thunderbolt was heavy, brutish, nicknamed Jug for its bulbous fuselage. It could not turn with a Messerschmitt, it did not have the grace of a Spitfire or the raw speed of a Mustang. But it had other qualities. It was rugged, radial engine in front, pilot protected by armor plate, and capable of absorbing damage that would destroy lighter aircraft and still bring its pilot home. It could carry ordnance, not just machine guns, though its .850 caliber Brownings were formidable. It could carry bombs, up to 2,500 pounds in various configurations. And it could carry rockets. 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, M8, carried in clusters under the wings. Each rocket had the penetration power of a medium artillery shell and could be fired in salvos while the aircraft screamed earthward at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. The transformation began in the weeks after D-Day. Fighter-bomber squadrons, initially tasked with air superiority and interdiction of German supply lines, began to operate as flying artillery, responding to requests from ground forces for immediate support. The system was improvised at first. Forward air controllers with radios, smoke grenades to mark targets, pilots learning to identify enemy positions from altitude while under anti-aircraft fire. But it worked, and as it worked, it refined. By July 1944, the system had become brutally efficient. A ground commander encountering German armor could radio coordinates. Within minutes, sometimes less than 10 minutes, a flight of Thunderbolts or Hawker Typhoons would arrive overhead. The pilots would circle, identify the target, roll into attack dives, and release ordnance. Then they would strafe with machine guns, climb, circle, and attack again until they exhausted their ammunition or the target stopped moving. The Germans called this the Jabot-Schreck, the fighter-bomber terror. Tank crews learned to recognize the sound of approaching aircraft, a sound that meant death was accelerating toward you at terminal velocity and there was nowhere to hide. The Tiger's thick armor, designed to defeat projectiles fired horizontally across a battlefield, was far thinner on top. The engine deck, the turret roof, the rear plate where the transmission lived, these were vulnerabilities. A rocket or bomb striking from above could penetrate where a Sherman's gun could not. And unlike tank engagements, which required line of sight and favorable positioning, aircraft could attack from any angle, any direction, whenever the weather permitted flight. The statistics tell a story that individual accounts can only suggest. In the month following the Normandy invasion, German panzer divisions reported tank losses at rates that exceeded their ability to replace them. The 21st Panzer Division, which had begun the campaign with over 120 operational tanks, was reduced to fewer than 30 by mid-July. The Panzer Lehr Division, considered one of the best equipped and best trained armored formations in the Wehrmacht, lost 83% of its tanks and self-propelled guns in the first 6 weeks of the campaign. Post-war analysis of destroyed German armor in Normandy revealed that approximately 50% of total losses were attributable to air attack, not to enemy tanks, not to anti-tank guns, but to aircraft. The psychological impact exceeded even the material losses. Panzer crews who had spent years believing in their invincibility found themselves trapped in metal coffins whenever the sky was clear. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Kursk and Kharkov, reported that Normandy was worse, not because the fighting was more intense, but because there was no defense. Against Soviet tanks, you could maneuver, use terrain, rely on your armor and gun. Against aircraft, you could only hide or die. One Tiger commander, interviewed after his capture in August 1944, stated, "We feared the Yabos more than your tanks, more than your artillery. When the Yabos came, there was nothing to do but hope they chose someone else. It was not combat, it was execution." The symbolic object that came to represent this transformation was not a weapon or a piece of equipment, it was a sound. The whistling shriek of a diving Thunderbolt or Typhoon, engine roaring at full throttle, air screaming over wings and rockets. German soldiers called it the Heulen, the howling. It was a sound that preceded immolation. Crews learned to recognize it instantly, to distinguish it from artillery or mortar fire, because the sound meant you had perhaps 3 seconds to decide whether to abandon your tank or stay inside and hope the aircraft missed. Most chose to stay. Leaving a tank under fire was often more dangerous than remaining, but staying meant experiencing those 3 seconds in full. Accounts from survivors described time dilating, stretching, as the sound grew louder, and the mind calculated trajectories and probabilities and acknowledged that none of it mattered because the decision had already been made by someone 5,000 feet above who would never see your face. One particular engagement, documented extensively because of its tactical significance, illustrates the transformation of armored warfare that summer. On July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy hedgerows, began with a massive aerial bombardment along a narrow front. Over 1,500 heavy bombers and 400 fighter bombers attacked German positions for 3 hours, dropping nearly 5,000 tons of high explosive on an area measuring roughly 5 miles by 1 mile. The bombardment was supposed to annihilate German defenses and open a corridor for American armor. It achieved that, but at terrible cost. Some bombs fell short, killing over 100 American soldiers and wounding 500 more. But the Germans suffered incomparably worse. The Panzer Lehr Division, positioned directly under the bombardment, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Survivors reported that the landscape had been transformed into a lunar surface, craters overlapping craters, hedgerows obliterated, roads erased. Tanks that had not been destroyed directly were immobilized, buried under earth and rubble. Crews that survived the bombing were found wandering in shock, unable to respond to orders. But it was the fighter bombers that completed the destruction. As the heavy bombers withdrew, flights of P-47s and P-38s prowled the bombed area, hunting survivors. Any vehicle that moved, any tank that attempted to withdraw, was marked and destroyed. German commanders attempting to organize counterattacks found their units paralyzed, not by lack of will, but by the certainty that any movement in daylight invited annihilation from above. One regimental commander radioed to division headquarters, "We cannot maneuver. The Yabos are overhead constantly. Any vehicle that moves is destroyed within minutes. We are combat ineffective, not because of casualties, but because we cannot leave our positions." The transformation in American tactical thinking was as complete as the destruction of German armor. In the months following Normandy, U.S. armor doctrine shifted fundamentally. Tank commanders were trained to advance with air support on call, to use their Shermans not as primary tank killers, but as exploitation forces that moved after the fighter bombers had cleared the way. The weakness of the Sherman's gun became less relevant when Tigers were already burning before the first tank engagement. Artillery-forward observers were trained to double as forward air controllers. Radio communication between ground and air forces became standardized, efficient, routine. By the time American forces reached Germany itself in 1945, the system had become so refined that tactical airstrikes could be delivered on targets within minutes of identification, often with precision sufficient to destroy specific buildings or vehicles without damaging adjacent structures. The Germans attempted to adapt. Anti-aircraft guns were deployed with panzer formations, light flak guns, quad-mounted 20mm weapons that could shred an aircraft on a low-level attack run. But this created a tactical dilemma. The flak guns had to be deployed in the open to be effective, which meant they were visible from the air and became targets themselves. Flak suppression became a standard part of fighter-bomber tactics. The first aircraft in the flight would strafe the anti-aircraft positions, while subsequent aircraft attacked the primary target. Camouflage became obsessive. Tanks were hidden under trees, in barns, beneath camouflage netting. But camouflage only worked if the vehicle remained stationary, and stationary armor cannot conduct offensive operations. The fundamental problem remained. German tactical doctrine depended on mobile armored operations, and mobile operations in daylight were suicidal when the enemy owned the sky. Some German commanders understood this earlier than others. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in Normandy, had experienced fighter-bomber attacks in North Africa and understood their implications. In a report to Hitler in mid-July 1944, shortly before Rommel was wounded in an air attack on his staff car, he wrote, "The enemy has complete command of the air. His fighter bombers attack anything that moves, day or night. Our panzer formations cannot maneuver without suffering devastating losses. We cannot conduct mobile warfare under these conditions. We can only defend, and defensive warfare in this terrain against this enemy is a war of attrition we cannot win." Hitler rejected this assessment. The Tiger tank, like much of German military mythology, had become an article of faith rather than a tactical asset to be used realistically. Replacement Tigers were allocated to Normandy even as they became targets on roads that were under constant aerial surveillance. Tank commanders were ordered to hold positions, to conduct counterattacks, to operate as though it were 1941 and the Luftwaffe still controlled European skies. They obeyed and they died, and their tanks burned in hedgerows and villages and along roads where blackened hulls would remain for years after the war as monuments to misplaced faith in steel. The summer of 1944 killed more than tanks. It killed a doctrine, a worldview, a way of understanding warfare that had dominated German military thinking since the Spanish Civil War. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war of massed armor and tactical air support, had been a German innovation. The Luftwaffe had pioneered close air support with Stuka dive bombers in Poland and France. But by 1944, the Luftwaffe was a spent force, and the Americans had perfected what the Germans had invented. The irony was noted by surviving German officers after the war. General Heinz Guderian, architect of Panzer doctrine, wrote in his memoirs, "We taught them combined arms warfare. We showed them how armor and aircraft could work together." And then they turned our lessons against us with resources we could never match and ruthlessness we had not anticipated. The resources mattered. American industrial capacity produced 18,000 P-47 Thunderbolts during the war. Germany produced approximately 1,350 Tigers. The Americans could afford to lose aircraft, and they did in substantial numbers, because low-level ground attack remained dangerous even against suppressed defenses. But the lost aircraft were replaced within days. Lost pilots were replaced within weeks. The system continued functioning regardless of individual losses. Germany could not replace Tigers at remotely comparable rates. Each lost tank represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor, rare metals, engineering capacity that could not be replicated. By late 1944, Tiger production had effectively ceased, not because the design was obsolete, but because the factories could not obtain materials and the transportation network that might have delivered completed tanks to combat units was being systematically destroyed by the same aircraft that hunted the tanks themselves. There is a photograph taken by a reconnaissance aircraft on August 8, 1944, near Mortagne, France. It shows a road clogged with destroyed German vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, all burning or burned out. Approximately 40 vehicles are visible in a single image covering perhaps half a mile of road. This was the result of a single day's interdiction missions by P-47 squadrons responding to a German counterattack. The attack had been Hitler's personal order, a last desperate attempt to cut off American forces and reach the coast. It failed catastrophically, not primarily because of ground resistance, but because the counterattack was conducted in clear weather, and the fighter-bombers came in waves all day until the German columns simply stopped moving. Survivors described the attack as apocalyptic. One German officer, captured shortly afterwards, stated, "It was not a battle, it was slaughter. The aircraft came and came and came. We could not fight them. We could only die." The transformation was complete. The Tiger tank, symbol of German armored supremacy, had become a liability, too valuable to lose, too vulnerable to use effectively, too expensive to replace. Tank commanders who had begun the war with confidence in steel and firepower ended it with eyes on the sky, flinching at engine sounds, calculating not how to destroy enemy tanks, but how to hide from enemy aircraft. The psychological inversion was total. After the war, Allied intelligence teams surveyed the Normandy battlefield, cataloging destroyed vehicles, determining causes of loss, studying what had worked and what had failed. The findings confirmed what the crews had experienced. Air power had become the dominant factor in ground combat. One report concluded, armored forces operating without air superiority or in conditions where enemy air power is not suppressed will suffer casualties at rates that make sustained offensive operations impossible. The doctrine of the tank as primary ground combat weapon had not been invalidated, but it had been subordinated. Tanks could dominate ground, but only if friendly air forces dominated sky. The sound remained in memory for those who survived. German veterans of Normandy, interviewed decades after the war, could still describe it. The whistling shriek of the diving jawbo, the particular tone and pitch that meant death was seconds away. Some said they heard it in nightmares. Others said they heard it when civilian aircraft flew overhead, a phantom sound that triggered reflexes decades old. The howling had imprinted itself not just on the battlefield, but on the men who endured it, a permanent reminder that invincibility is always conditional, always temporary, always dependent on factors beyond the thickness of your armor or the power of your gun. The final Tiger tanks destroyed in Normandy burned in late August during the retreat through the Falaise Pocket. Trapped between American forces advancing from the south and Canadian and British forces pushing from the north, German formations attempted to escape through a narrowing corridor. The fighter-bombers turned the corridor into a killing ground. Aircraft stacked at different altitudes, attacking in rotation, dropping bombs and firing rockets at vehicles that had nowhere to go. The Tigers, designed to fight on open steppes where their gun range and armor thickness provided advantage, were immobilized in traffic jams where those qualities meant nothing. Some crews abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot. Others stayed and died. The wrecks were still there when the war ended, pushed to roadsides by Allied engineers clearing routes, rusting slowly in the French rain. There is a larger truth here, beyond tactics and statistics, beyond destroyed armor and casualty rates. It is this: faith in a single weapon, a single system, a single approach to warfare is a fatal weakness when the enemy refuses to fight on your terms. The Germans trusted tigers because tigers had proven trustworthy. The doctrine made sense, the tactics were sound, the engineering was extraordinary, but all of it assumed the kind of warfare that was already obsolete, assumed that battles would be decided by direct engagement between comparable forces, that superior quality could compensate for inferior numbers, that the rules would remain consistent. The Americans broke those rules. They did not try to build better tanks, though they would eventually. They did not try to match Tiger armor or gun power. They changed the battlefield itself, made it three-dimensional, made the sky as relevant as the ground, and applied industrial power to aerial warfare with the same overwhelming commitment they had applied to every other aspect of the conflict. The P-47, symbol of American abundance and pragmatism, could not have been built by any other nation in 1944. It required aluminum and skilled labor and the industrial capacity to produce engines and ordnance at scales that turned individual aircraft from precious assets into expendable tools. Each P-47 represented the same truth as the sandwiches carried on submarines. We have more, and more behind that, and more behind that, and we are coming. The Tiger burned because it was alone, because the Luftwaffe could not protect it, because German industry could not replace it, because the doctrine that made it effective required conditions that no longer existed. Because, in the end, the most powerful tank in the world is only powerful until someone changes the rules of the game. The fields of Normandy are quiet now. The wrecks are gone, salvaged decades ago, melted down and recycled into peacetime products. The hedgerows remain. The villages have been rebuilt. Tourists walk roads where tigers burned and do not know what they are walking over. But the lesson remains, embedded in history like shrapnel. Never trust in steel alone. Never believe in invincibility. Because the sky is always watching. And when the sky decides to kill you, all your armor is just a bigger target. And all your faith is just weight to carry into fire. The howling comes for everyone eventually. And when it comes, there is no hiding. There is only the sound, growing louder, and the knowledge that what you trusted has betrayed you, not through failure, but through irrelevance. The world changed, the weapon did not. And that is how empires burn.